Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to have you all here today for this event organized by PSIA for the PSIA community within Sciences Po. Event title is Victims' Right in the United Nations, and we're very pleased to have Jane Connors, Victims' Right Advocate for the United Nations. It is the first lecture during this semester that, as you know, will be entirely online. And we decided to have our traditional Wednesday afternoon lecture, and we would like to continue this tradition to have it online. So I'm very pleased to have, as first event, the possibility to host such a distinguished speaker as Jane Connors. We are organizing, of course, the next Wednesday. I can tell you that probably in the next two Wednesdays, we will have two very interesting events. One around the last speech on the State of the Union by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. We'll have some distinguished speakers giving their comments on this very important speech. And the other one will be on the Belarus situation and the relationship with Europe, human rights there, and the evolution in the area. We know it is another crucial topic, and we are very interested in, of course, being in the mobilization, but it is not just that. It is more than that. It is also how to understand what is going on there and how to follow the situation. So I think today's event for us is really very important because I like just to briefly present biography of Jane Connors. We are honored, Jane, to have you here with us. She was appointed to her present role in August 17. In her previous role, she was Amnesty International Director of International Advocacy. And in '96, she joined the United Nations, where she worked until March 2015, positions at headquarters in New York and at the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. Before joining the UN, she was a law teacher at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, Universities of Lancaster, Nottingham, and in the United Kingdom, and the University of Canberra and the Australian National University in Australia. Mrs. Connors holds a Masters of Law, Bachelor of Laws, and Bachelor of Arts from the Australian National University. And in July 19, she was awarded a doctorate in law honoris causa by the Australian National University. I'm very pleased also to welcome Anne Charbord, who will lead the Q&A and give the conclusion of our today's lecture. Anne Charbord is an international human rights lawyer focusing on human rights and security. She's currently legal advisor to the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights while countering terrorism, and a visiting scholar at the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School. She teaches human rights and counterterrorism at PSIA in Paris, and thank you very much. And she was nominated by UNHCR to serve as a judge in the Cour nationale du droit d'asile. Thank you, Anne, for being with us at PSIA, of course, and thank you because of today. So, Jane, I stop here immediately because our students are so excited to have you here today, and I give you immediately the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the warm welcome and very nice words. Thank you also to Anne, who's an old friend of mine. I'm very happy to see her. I'm very happy to hear of her achievements also. And also thank you to Maria Zenay and everybody else who's been involved in organising the seminar. I also want to thank all participants. I'm sure there are many things they could be doing. I also hope that you, all of you, and your families are safe and well and coping during this extremely uncertain time, as I am trying to do myself. What I'm going to do in the time I will speak to you will be to provide background information on sexual exploitation and abuse by United Nations personnel. Then I'll outline my work and as the first victims' rights advocate, now 3 years old, and that of my office, and also of the senior victims' rights advocates that I had operating in the field. I'll then reflect on the challenges that our work is confronted with, including COVID-19. If I have time, I'll get to COVID-19. You've been given some documentation, or you've been provided some documentation by my colleague Jackie from headquarters, and you may want to look at those at some point. Before I start, I just wanted to pose a question to you in this cloud format, and that question will appear on the screen. But basically, I wanted to ask you, in what field do you aspire to work? You've got about 40 seconds to answer that question. I know that you all know how to do this because you've done it before. And then Anne will take over and see the themes that have been raised during those answers.
So lots of answers already coming in. Journalism, security, development, diplomacy, international work, obviously, human rights, which I'm very pleased to see. Intelligence, policymaking, human rights taking a very large place on the screen right now. Diplomacy, academia, migration, international development, international relations, gender work, environment, migration, and the security and development nexus I see here at the bottom. So lots of different topics here, but human rights, diplomacy, gender, and environment, right up there in the middle, Jane.
Great. I think that's wonderful. Some of us have done that ourselves, but it's wonderful to see, and I would really like a copy of all that. It's very interesting to see that cloud, because it does make me feel very, very hopeful, very inspired by the generation that will move forward. So I'll start with a bit of background, and that will be starting with letting you know that we have about 100,000 staff members of the 35 United entities which make up the United Nations system. It's a complex system and takes a long time to get to know. I'm still getting to know it. We have many non-staff personnel. These include about 100,000 uniformed military and police. And we also have countless contractors and partners. And the majority of these perform their work with integrity, compliant with the United Nations standards and the spirit of its charter. But unfortunately, United Nations activities have been undermined by allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeeping, humanitarian, and development personnel. And many of these allegations have been substantiated. To our collective shame, their victims are the women, men, and children that we have pledged to protect and serve. Similarly, allegations have implicated people working in charities and other organizations delivering humanitarian and development aid. Often these organizations implement our programs on the ground, United Nations programs on the ground, and they and their staff are described as implementing partners. These wrongs, of course, cause harm and suffering to victims, often leaving them with children. They have a profound negative impact on communities in the short and longer term, including by normalizing these behaviors suggesting they are permissible. They also fracture trust amongst populations, undermining the United Nations legitimacy, compromising and indeed sometimes frustrating its essential work. Our entities have sought to respond to allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse for over 20 years. We have successive Secretaries General implementing what is described as a zero tolerance approach, and we have many policy, prevention and response measures. There is a wonderful UN website, you can see them all. That's only the United Nations Secretariat. If you go to the funds, agencies and programs, you see even more. The overarching policies are set out in two documents. Firstly, the 6 core principles of what is called the Interagency Standing Committee, which is a coordination mechanism for United Nations and non-United Nations partners providing humanitarian assistance. And then we have the 2003 Secretary General's Bulletin on Special Measures for Protection from Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse. And that bulletin is more or less our legislative framework, which governs the behaviour of United Nations personnel. The terms of that bulletin are reflected in the rules of all United Nations system entities. They also appear in the revised Model Memorandum of Understanding for military contingents and formed police units, which are concluded with the countries which provide those personnel. The definitions are important to note, and you have that document. It's a short document, worthwhile reading at some point. Sexual exploitation is defined as any actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power or trust for sexual purposes, including but not limited to profiting monetarily, socially or politically from the sexual exploitation of another. And sexual abuse constitutes the actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, whether by force or unequal or coercive conditions. I read those out because they're quite interesting in terms of how current they might be, and if any of you are familiar with national legal systems, they go beyond many of them in fact. The Bulletin prohibits any sexual activity with a child, and a child is a person under the age of 18, and that is irrespective of the local age of majority, the consent of that young person, or mistaken belief of the perpetrator. It also prohibits any exchange of money, employment, goods or services for sex, and there's no exception provided for national context or that of the country of the perpetrator. So it's irrelevant that, for example, prostitution, sex work is legal in the country in which the act occurs, or that the country of the perpetrator legalizes prostitution. So that it's more or less a, there we have it, you are not entitled to engage in that behavior. It describes sexual relationships between United Nations staff and beneficiaries of assistance as being based on inherently unequal power dynamics, which undermine the credibility and integrity of the work of the United Nations, and these are therefore strongly discouraged. I've worked in issues relating to gender-based violence for a long time, and therefore I don't take a very romantic view of things like this. I'd like to see these relationships prohibited, but this is a contested idea. Last year, the Interagency Standing Committee that I spoke about sought to clarify what this meant by providing that any sexual relationship between those providing humanitarian assistance and protection that involves improper use of rank or position is prohibited. Such relationships undermine the credibility of humanitarian aid work. I don't think that clarifies much at all. It more or less adds a few more words to what we already know. The acts that I've described in the Bulletin, and the Bulletin in itself sets out that these constitute serious misconduct, and they are grounds for administrative and disciplinary measures. Where allegations are substantiated, that means United Nations staff are dismissed and uniformed personnel are repatriated. From the end of 2018, and this probably is the greater disincentive, the name of the individuals concerned as well as those who left for any reason during an investigation, are included in a system-wide database, United Nations system-wide database called ClearCheck, and that is directed to precluding further re-employment and or missions service. It's now implemented by most of our entities, and it was introduced, of course, because there is a revolving door type situation with people who engage in this conduct. Despite all of this, we do receive allegations. We continue to do so. They're reported in what the United Nations describes as real time, so a little bit later than what real time would be for the rest of us, on the United Nations website. So we've provided you, I believe, with the address of the website, and it's worthwhile looking at. Allegations of staff of entities outside the Secretariat are also reported, as are those concerning our implementing partners. And since 2015, allegations relating to uniformed personnel identify their country, as well as where the incident occurred, and allegations relating to civilians in missions identify the mission concerned. With regard to the funds and programs in our implementing partners, that information isn't provided, just that something has occurred. Allegations, of course, not only appear on our website, but they surface in the media. And the media finds these allegations very interesting and makes sure that they are well publicized. And academics are very interested in this area of work, so they surface through academic research. Now, coming more closer to where I am, our Secretary General, the current Secretary General, as other Secretaries General, takes an extremely dim view of this behaviour. And in taking his oath of office in late 2016, he pledged to prioritise prevention and response to sexual exploitation and abuse. And true to his word, in his first week on the job in early 2017, he tasked one of his staff to develop a game-changing strategy. And this is set out in his report to the General Assembly on Special Measures for Protection from Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, a new approach, which was published in late February 2017. The strategy has 4 aspects: putting the rights and dignity of victims first, ending impunity, building a multi-stakeholder approach, and reorienting United Nations communications towards transparency and creating a global platform for sharing best practices. Translating the last, that means we are going to be transparent, we are going to be more open about the behaviour of our personnel and not dwell on the reputation of the organisations as much as we had in the past. I'm only going to talk about the rights and dignity of victims first, because that's where my role comes in. This focus on victims is very different from earlier strategies. Those generally privileged the reputation of our organisations and the conduct and discipline of personnel. One commentator describes that as a human resources approach, which doesn't get to the root of the behaviour and why it persists. In order to operationalise this victims' rights approach, a victim-centred approach, the Secretary General created my role, the role of victims' rights advocate, to work across the United Nations system at headquarters and in the field, to identify ways to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, and if they occur, to promote and protect victims' rights to report and receive support, ensure that their cases are properly managed, and perpetrators held accountable. At the same time, he instructed his missions in the 4 countries from which the greatest number of allegations had been received. They are Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, and South Sudan. And with the exception of Haiti, those 3 other missions do in fact generate the most allegations. He instructed them to appoint field victims' rights advocates, or designate field victims' rights advocates. The idea of which was that they would accompany victims. They would do as much as they could when victims were identified, accompanying them through the processes that were relevant to them. An important part of this is that our roles are system-wide. They're not only applicable to peacekeeping, but also to humanitarian and development settings, and encompass wrongs not only by international but national personnel. And I think the general view of sexual exploitation of United Nations personnel is a guy with a blue helmet in a tank with a gun. There are broader people involved in this misconduct. We started our work in September 2017, so 3 years on the job, 3 years for me last Friday. These were entirely new roles for the United Nations. We had vague terms of reference, extremely limited budgetary resources. In fact, my first job was to argue before the UN's budgetary bodies that we should be funded, we should be established and resourced. Apart from that, I really didn't know what, I had very little to go on, because if you're the first, you have little to go on. You're either a great disappointment, or at least you do something, but you're the first. So you really have to think your way through. What I did to begin with was to just talk to people, brief member states, United Nations entities, intergovernmental and regional organizations, civil society and academia, to explain my role and what a victim-centered approach entails. And that's quite interesting, because when you ask people what is a victim-centered approach, they all say it means putting victims at the center. So that doesn't get you very far. It's not something that is well known. I also supported those advocates in the field to establish themselves as the main contact for victims on the ground. But my mind changed a bit when I conducted my first visit in October 2017 to the Central African Republic, about 3 weeks after starting work, and not to put too much pressure on me, with the Secretary General. So you could imagine, here you are, you're the first, you're going on your first mission, and you're going with the Secretary General, just to make everything easy. During that time, I met victims, and when I met them and heard them and spoke to them, I understood that what was most important with regard to my role was to give them voice and visibility. Since that time, and I can't visit countries anymore because of the various mitigation measures with regard to COVID, I have visited 6 countries with varying United Nations presences, and I went back to Qna. During each visit, I met victims individually and confidentially, and I can tell you what they tell me about. They talk about complex, inaccessible, or unclear complaint pathways. They, of course, complain about the conduct, but in terms of their own experience. Lack of protection, limited or no assistance on health, education, and livelihoods. Concerns for their children, distressing investigative procedures marked by repeated interviews and lack of clarity in process. Little support for legal or other redress, especially paternity child support claims. And they often have difficulties accessing documents, laboratory results, and so on. And a common grievance is they receive patchy or no information on the progress of their cases. We provided you with the 2019 report, which gives you an idea of my work. One of the big things I engaged in was mapping of services available in 13 countries. That was an enormous amount of work, and we found that the services were pretty patchy. I'm also at the end game of developing a statement on victims' rights, so that individuals and communities are made aware of the behaviour they should expect for United Nations personnel and those who deliver our programs, and what their rights are if they are harmed in any way. That is a very difficult task. It involves a lot of discussion across the UN system, and one can only say that we're all not on the same page. I'm also preparing a companion document for United Nations staff. The report describes the field victims' rights advocates' role and work, and I have to say I'm just so impressed by the work of my advocates on the ground. They've been very engaged in a very practical way with paternity child support claims. They've done things such as provided help to set up bank accounts to receive maintenance payments. They've supported victims to give testimony in courts martial. They've assisted community-based mechanisms, implement preventive measures, receive and channel complaints, and they've also developed and implemented livelihood projects which support victims rebuild their lives. I'll just point out the challenges before I stop. I was a law lecturer, as you heard, so I'm programmed for 50 minutes, so I will make sure I won't go for 50 minutes. On assistance, this is a real challenge. There's a 2007 document entitled Snappily, Comprehensive Strategy on Assistance and Support to Victims of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, which is directed to ensuring that victims receive appropriate assistance in a timely manner. It's unfunded, and it makes clear that it in no way diminishes or replaces the individual responsibility of the perpetrators and is not intended as a means of compensation. It's also premised on the understanding that assistance and support should be provided through existing services, programs, and their networks. Now, that mapping I referred to shows that services for victims are generally rolled into existing programming for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. And these services are variable in availability and quality. They rarely address the specific needs of victims of sexual exploitation by United Nations personnel, in particular legal assistance and protection. We have an obligation to provide some form of legal assistance if children are born of sexual exploitation and abuse. And though there may be some support for victims of sexual and gender-based violence in this area, it's not the same. I don't believe the responsibility is as great. We also don't have comprehensive and accurate data on victims, nor do we have a system-wide tool to track victims, the assistance they receive and available services. They move, you know, they don't just hang about waiting for us. And during the COVID-19 situation, they have moved across national borders in order to seek safety. Some support is provided through projects funded by a small United Nations trust fund. But often it's, of course, a very bureaucratic process, a trust fund, and often the support comes too little, too late. We also have a problem with unreporting. Research, you may have come across it, published last year. It got a lot of airplay in a quiet week before the end of the year. This research on children fathered by peacekeepers in Haiti found that victims didn't report because they didn't know how to do so, lacked trust, feared stigma, abandonment or reprisals, or received incentives or threats from the perpetrator, families or communities, or they thought nothing would happen. In some countries also, reporting poses grave risks. The national legal system may have negative elements, may criminalize the provider of transactional sex, impose penalties for same-sex sexual activity or adultery, which is essentially sex outside marriage, or allow for reparatory marriage, which is that lovely custom where the wrong goes away if the victim marries the perpetrator, or tolerate what are described as honour crimes. Investigations may have flaws also. United Nations investigators investigate all forms of misconduct, fraud, theft, and etc. They mightn't, we're getting better, but they might not have the training required for sexual exploitation and abuse cases. Investigators may come with unconscious bias, which can result in unconscious or even conscious disrespect. And they may subject the victim to repeated interviews. They may have a particular view. They might think the victim is unreliable, just the same as national cases. We all know how victims of sexual assault are treated by investigators at the national level in certain contexts. The victim might also not decide to participate in the process, and that might make the investigator believe that obviously it's going to be more difficult if the victim doesn't cooperate, but still it would be possible to investigate. Investigators also, some of them have a very strange view that a victim-centred approach means that the victim can decide to withdraw, more or less veto a disciplinary process, which of course is really useful for a perpetrator. If they know that a victim, the investigator might think that, the perpetrator will be very encouraging of the victim to do so. These sorts of flaws are of course in national legal systems, civil or criminal purposes, and there are other factors, and there are many other factors, of course, which affect the success or otherwise of domestic legal proceedings. Justice, accountability and remedies. This is the big area. This remains elusive for victims. The United Nations is an employer. It's very important that that is understood. It doesn't have a judicial arm. It is only empowered to impose administrative or disciplinary sanctions on perpetrators where allegations are substantiated. It doesn't have criminal jurisdiction and cannot provide individual relief to victims. Where criminal accountability is concerned, it's very complex. Different legal regimes apply to different categories of personnel, but in general, jurisdiction lies outside the country where the act took place, and the support of the state of jurisdiction is critical. This is also the case with civil cases such as paternity child support claims. Our role is to cooperate. The United Nations must cooperate with states to achieve accountability. But it's important to note that legal obstacles preventing states pursuing accountability are inflated. Personnel are not immune from suit in the country of jurisdiction, and we are finding more and more that extraterritorial jurisdiction for crimes is available. But one big thing is where criminal accountability is concerned, the acts involved must meet the definition of a crime in the country in the state of jurisdiction. And sexual exploitation frequently does not meet the definition of a crime. And indeed, some elements of sexual abuse might not meet the definition of a crime in the country of jurisdiction. And the country of jurisdiction may not have a victim-oriented legal framework, so that's something to bear in mind. And the usual challenges surrounding realising paternity child support claims at the national level are exacerbated if you've got more than one jurisdiction. The obstacles to achieving accountability are manifold. They may be political, there may be a weak protective environment for victims, including because of customary, cultural or stereotypical perspectives. Victims usually don't know their rights, can't afford a lawyer or access legal aid, and few lawyers that I've come across know how to deal with these sorts of cases, which involve several jurisdictions. Victims also mightn't see the point. They're some of the challenges. COVID-19, I think we can go through this in question and answer. There were two issues that arise with regard to the pandemic. We saw from the Ebola response that the arrival of people to support humanitarian responses coincided with spikes in sexual exploitation and abuse. And we saw that also in the floods in Mozambique. This is because those in vulnerable situations become even more vulnerable and often engage in transactional sex to survive. During these periods also, vetting of staff may be less rigorous, and there might be more limited oversight because of restricted access. So we got very agitated about that, and we developed a lot of material. One document has been sent to you for you to look at by the International Agency Standing Committee, and I was involved in its authorship as well. But we haven't seen allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse in the context of the pandemic, but reports of past wrongs have surfaced. But as you know, now we're seeing a bit of loosening up with regard to access to these countries, so this may be the difficult time. The other issue is with regard to provision of assistance to victims. Of course, mitigation measures which lock down our staff, they're not as locked down as they were before, and restricted movement had significant consequences for assistance and support to victims. And victims also moved, as I said. Many of them, certainly in Africa, moved across porous borders so that they would be safer. However, again, I've just been so impressed by the work of my colleagues on the ground, particularly those field victims' rights advocates, who have remained in contact with victims through things like this, through Zoom calls, through cell phones, making sure that they've been in touch with implementing partners who were not as affected by the lockdown. So we have had assistance continuing, and complaint mechanisms have been strengthened, though sadly our activities within the projects funded by that trust fund have had to shut down because of social distancing concerns. I'll stop at this point. We've given you, I think, I'm told by my staff to say, please follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at @UN_OVRA. I also wanted to make sure that you know that we have online internships and online UNV roles. I think as you go through your studies, you should think about the UN as that nice cloud. A lot of those things that you could do, what has appeared on the screen, you can do through working in the United Nations. So that's all from me, a little bit over time, but not as badly as usual. Thank you.
Brilliant. Jane, thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation on this very difficult topic. It was a very good overview of what sexual exploitation and abuse by UN personnel is, but you also highlighted the work of your mandate, of your office, but also the main challenges that it faces. So now we have a little bit over half an hour for the interactive Q&A session. So I'm going to invite all of the participants who have listened to you, who would like to ask you a question, to do so using the Q&A box. It's a little box, a tool that we have here at the bottom of the screen. I know that some of you have already started using the box. It would be great if you could introduce yourself first, just your first name, maybe where you're from, maybe your program of studies at Qna, or your general field of studies and your interests. I'm also going to ask you to please keep your questions concise. That will make it much easier for us to be able to pick them up. So while I leave a little bit of time to the participants to write down their questions, I'll use this opportunity to ask you a first question, Jane. We have all heard in the news and the media of terrible cases of these alleged sexual exploitation and abuse of women, men, and children by UN personnel in the field. In the DRC, you mentioned them, in the DRC, in Mali, in South Sudan, Haiti, just to name a few. I was surprised to hear in your presentation that the UN had been trying to address this problem for over 20 years in various ways. I heard what you said about the novelty of the approach put forward by the incoming Secretary General in 2017. But my question is this: why does sexual exploitation and abuse by UN personnel continue to take place despite all of these efforts? Do we have any clues as to what the dynamics behind this are?
Thanks for the question. This is the most difficult question, and I think it's interesting. In his 2017 report, the Secretary General suggested entrenched discrimination, unequal gender relations, profound vulnerabilities in populations lie at the root of the misbehaviours, or these misbehaviours, these wrongs. And I think it's an exacerbation of what goes on at national level with regard to sexual and gender-based violence, with regard to women, children, and of course men as well. In the countries where these acts occur, I think you have to be aware of the context. Sexual and gender-based violence against women exists, and to a certain extent boys, it goes on in the communities generally, and it's linked to their very low status. And this is reflected in legislation, customary practices, and we have, for example, child marriage, and we see a spike in child marriage during COVID-19. And practices such as an extraordinary practice they have in South Sudan, which is called child booking, where you can book a child for marriage, more or less before the child is born or after the child is born, generally a girl, and also impunity. So we have a context which exists already of unequal gender relations, entrenched discrimination. And we have these conducts. And for example, if you think of South Sudan, there's a Human Rights Council mechanism on South Sudan, and in one of its earliest reports, it indicated that the majority of women and girls in that country had experienced rape or sexual abuse of some sort. So if you've got that at the country level. And yesterday, in the general debate, the Secretary General, speaking in the context of COVID-19, but I think we can expand it, spoke of a hidden war on women, which is constituted by sexual and gender-based violence. So I think of the context, and then added to this, the populations are affected by armed conflict, intercommunal violence, and this leads to displacement, loss of livelihoods, hunger, and other impacts. I mean, one of the countries I went to was Colombia in 2019, and there I went to the border with Venezuela, and it was really striking to me to see the people coming across the bridge from Venezuela, looking and moving across Colombia to remaining in Colombia, moving across Colombia, perhaps to go to other countries in the continent. But you saw that they had left their livelihoods behind, and I was particularly, I think the thing that struck me is that their babies had Pampers, which it just strikes you in a particular way. So those people. And you also have hunger and other impacts such as disease and so on. So you have that, you have a context, you have the vulnerability, and then these factors all come together to facilitate sexual exploitation and abuse by outsiders, especially those who are equipped to provide support. And people often don't understand their power. They have no idea that in terms of a person with nothing, they are extraordinarily powerful. They themselves also may come from countries where women are undervalued. I'm just trying to think of a country where women are really valued, but there are countries where women are more undervalued than others, as are children, and where these wrongs are not sanctioned. So I think there's a perfect storm of a context, vulnerability, and an opportunity, and a failure to understand your power. We often say the culture should change. I'm not so sure about. I think it would be great to stop the behaviour and hope that culture catches up. So let's do what might be simpler at the outset, with the hope, and things. I mean, you can stop the behaviour. I mean, you can put in place measures so that the behaviour doesn't happen. And I have seen this in some contexts. I'm told never to say this because then there may be a spike, and it shows that it doesn't work out and so on. But you can, if you take a very I don't know, in general terms, if with violence against women and children, we haven't been. It hasn't been costly enough for people. I mean, I just think about changing behaviour with regard to driving when drunk, smoking, and so on. Real costs have been put in place for those who are involved in this behaviour. And I think making this more costly, focusing on the victim is a big thing, because you can then somehow personalise, somehow make the conduct, the human aspect of this conduct, a little bit more available to those who perpetrate it, and somehow stop that behaviour, address their behaviour. Sort of a roundabout answer, but as the Secretary General said when he introduced his report, there is no magic wand, and it's just a lot of hard work.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive answer. So the questions are pouring in, which is a very good thing, even though we might be running out of time quite quickly. There are a few questions that relate to the policy itself. The first question is whether UN interns, and this is a question from Marta, whether UN interns are included in this policy. And I guess the broader question here is, who is included? I mean, we've understood that it's peacekeepers, it's UN staff per se, but what about implementing partners, interns, etc., all those that are revolving around the core UN staff?
Just briefly, interns definitely. If in terms of perpetrators, I mean, if we're talking about victims, interns maybe no, but but they can be victims of sexual harassment, which is another regime entirely, but overlaps obviously. Interns will be perceived as being incorporated as under UN personnel, so there are, you know, volunteers and so on and so forth, even if they're unpaid. And any intern enters into a contractual relationship of some sort. Implementing partners are outside our authority, obviously, but there is a protocol which was adopted several years ago, which sets out the requirements that implementing partners must fulfill before the United Nations engages with them. So that's in order to, and what they must do with regard to sexual exploitation and abuse, and their requirements with regard to training, investigations, reporting, and things of that nature. And if they don't meet those requirements, then the UN will not engage with them. And also, if they do engage in some form of in sexual exploitation and abuse, the relationship between the United Nations and that implementing partner will be severed. And there was a case with regard to Caritas. Some of you may have come across it with respect to a staff member of Caritas in the Central African Republic. And it was problematic, you see, and Caritas provides an enormous amount of support and assistance to people in vulnerable situations in Central African Republic, but nonetheless, because of the failure with regard to sexual exploitation and abuse, the relationship was cut at that time. I don't know whether it's been reinstated, but certainly if there is, that is how implementing partners are dealt with. They themselves, so the big humanitarian NGOs they're involved with the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, and they themselves have umbrella organisations, and I've just come off a call earlier this morning with implementing partners organisations. The smaller ones are of course more complex because they may not meet these requirements, but there is a fund which allows for their investigations capacity to be stepped up and things of that nature. So yes, interns, implementing partners, more complicated, but because of the fact that most of our programs are implemented by those partners, they are, any allegations relating to them must be, if they're received by the UN, reported to the Secretary General, and they must be identified in that on our website, but they won't be identified necessarily by the partner concerned, but they will say implementing partner allegations X or Y or Z.
I see. I just have maybe a very quick follow-up question on that. Are there any implementing partners that the UN has stopped working with because of numerous allegations or lack of action on their part?
Well, the Caritas one, it did suspend operations. I'm sure there are others, but certainly that was the one which was the most obvious.
Okay.
And of course, we had the Oxfam thing, but that was an older case. And of course, the donors also, because most of these implementing partners are funded by donors. The donors will withdraw funding. But the Caritas case is the most recent, where there has been a suspension of activity.
Okay, thank you. There are also a few questions on on accountability and reparations. I mean, I think participants were surprised to hear that the comprehensive strategy that you mentioned was unfunded.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a number of questions, but I'm just going to pick up on maybe two. The first one is, what would hinder the UN from providing immediate funding to victims? What's preventing that, apart from the lack of funds, obviously, which leads me to the second question, which is, would it be the role, or is it the role of your office also to do some fundraising in order to have funds there?
On that comprehensive strategy unfunded, it is an annex to a General Assembly resolution. So it is the product of our bosses. So, and that's something to bear in mind. It is not a it is a comprehensive strategy, obviously, that we're involved in, but it was formulated by our, well, I don't know, they mightn't have there were certainly not 193, but 192 member states at the time. And it represents their desires and whatever. And their view, my understanding is, I wasn't around in 2007 when they were negotiating it, is that they have provided already, through their contributions that they are required to provide, resources which should be used by the UN to meet the needs of victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. So they're not going to do it, double dip, so to speak. With regard to immediate support and assistance, the Secretary General in 2016 instructed missions, so peacekeeping and special political missions, to provide out of their budgets immediate support and assistance, and that is provided. So, but that's the missions. Now, if you're talking about, then you have the agency's funds and programs, which are not the missions. The Secretary General may be, he doesn't have authority over all. It's very complicated. He has authority over some, but not over all. And there it becomes more difficult. And I am trying to get them to, they do, but to come to the realization that they should, in some way, we should come up with some funding formula whereby support and assistance could be provided. In terms of fundraising, there would never be a context wherein the UN would provide compensation, reparations, things of that nature, because it doesn't do that. That's not part of its policy. But there certainly we do through these projects, and other parts of the UN do through project formulations, provide support and assistance. For example, I worked with the former field victims' rights advocate in Haiti to get funds and programs to provide money, a very small amount of money, to allow children's school fees, their lunches, and their uniforms to be paid for, so that these, and we do know the number of children. We have about 20, and I think there are about 30 children born of sexual exploitation and abuse from the MINUSTA days, many years ago, to allow them to go to school. So there are possibilities, but yes, that was fundraising I was involved in, and yes, I could proceed with other forms of fundraising. The complication of the UN is that it's a big machine, and then, if, for example, it's a small, if the staff who engages in this conduct comes from a very small entity, we have funny little entities like the International Postal Union and things of that nature, we will then have, I would then engage, and I have engaged in conversations with their leadership about, you have to do this because this is your staff member, so to speak. The reparations issue is a big one. We don't have that has not been something that we've proceeded with, or restorative justice or things of that nature. It being the view that the accountability lies with the perpetrator.
Thank you. Let's maybe now turn to the investigation and the internal UN procedure. Somebody would like to know, what is the legal burden of proof at that level in order to be sanctioned?
It's clear and convincing. So that is the legal burden of proof for the Secretariat, so missions, and for most of the funds and programs. There is a higher burden of proof for entities that are under the umbrella of the legal framework of the International Labour Organization. So there are two burdens of proof, and it's a higher burden. I think it's almost beyond reasonable doubt. But with regard to, I think these burdens are pretty high myself, but clear and convincing is what they need. And this gets to substantiation, And I'm often, I was asked at the last meeting, the webinar I engaged in, you talk about substantiation. An unsubstantiated case doesn't mean it hasn't happened, and so that doesn't mean this didn't happen. And I think the Scots have, don't they, that middle ground? They have the verdict of unproven. So I think, that's something that I've always thought very highly of the Scots for that. So, but no, they're quite onerous burdens. But at the same time, one of my Office of Legal Affairs colleagues did a little bit of research into the impact, and her analysis was that it hadn't had as much impact as people might think, but I could have a look at her research again and see if that's quite true. Mm. I think it's very, at the national level also, it's very, very difficult. Any case involving a victim of sexual misconduct, of a crime, whatever, it's the whole unconscious bias kicks in.
So you've brought us directly to the next question I was going to ask you, which is precisely on national procedures. Mm-hmm. And one question is, you did touch upon this in your presentation, but what actually happens? So which are the courts that these, in which perpetrators can be put to trial? And what happens when the act itself is not criminalized in the legal system? Is there anything that can be done?
Well, there won't be criminal accountability if that is the state of jurisdiction, but that the accountability will reside in the fact that that person is no longer a staff member. So what happens with regard to accountability of a criminal nature is that matters, and this involves everything, which where we're dealing with civilian staff, matters which, in the opinion of the Office of Legal Affairs, come to the definition of criminal conduct, will be referred to the state of jurisdiction for proceeding. So your matter will be referred to your state, and the great hope is that your state will do something about it. With regard to uniformed personnel, they're under the jurisdiction of their contributing country, and it will be up to the contributing country as to how they proceed. And it will depend. Some will go through military processes, if they go through any processes. They may go through just administrative processes, and some may go through civilian processes. The case in Central African, not Central African Republic, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Africa, which has a lot of troops in the Congo, has been conducting courts martial with regard to those troops in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. that's a very good practice. And they're the victims, as I say, they have been supported by the field victims' rights advocates. So they are, it will, I mean, that's the other thing. You really have to push these countries and this is why it's lovely to speak to these participants, because they may come from some of these countries, so they can investigate what they do. I have to say the outcomes are not great. I mean, I don't think there's been a civilian who's been prosecuted for quite a long time. You can see on the website what happened to the military personnel. And often it just says, pending with the troop contributing country, pending with the police contributing country. And frequently, if there are proceedings, the penalties are not very high. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm fairly open about all of these things because I don't think there's any point in not being. And there are some cases relating, as you know, with regard to, I won't go into it, but you know what I'm going to say, that there are some cases relating to a country that you're quite close to, where proceedings haven't gone very far.
Quite right, quite right. So there's another question, which I think is a nice follow-on from what you just mentioned. How important is legal accountability in restoring victims' rights as compared or as opposed to social and psychological support, childcare services, etc., that might be given to a victim?
Yeah, this is where I usually get myself into big trouble, because I am a lawyer, as you heard, and I even have a practicing certificate. It's quite strange. And I don't underrate the power of the law. But when you speak to victims, and I have this friend who was a big wheel in the negotiation of the Rome Statute, Christian Benevazza. He once said that, you know, and he was joking, of course, it surprises him when he goes to meet people who have been, you know, sort of survivors of genocide and so on and so forth, that they don't say, I really want my case taken to the ICC. So similarly, when I meet with victims of sexual exploitation and abuse, they are concerned about those things that I told you they were concerned about. They are if they've got a child born of sexual exploitation and abuse, they're very concerned about that child. They are concerned about their health, they are concerned about their psychological situation, and they are concerned about the fact they've got no money. And they know that they've been wronged, and they do ask, you know, the UN should pay me, this, that, and the other thing. They rarely talk about the accountability of the perpetrator. I mean, and I'm not saying that the accountability of the perpetrator is unimportant, nor am I saying that the accountability of the perpetrator would not give them relief. I spoke to one young woman I spoke to in the Central African Republic, or she was a child still. She said she would like her perpetrator, she was a victim of abuse, she would like her perpetrator to be convicted of a crime, but in the meantime, she wanted to be able to upgrade her skills so that she could proceed, and she wanted to become a doctor. So she did. I mean, she said that would give her satisfaction, but in the meantime, this is what she would like. So I don't think there's either or. And that's why I always get myself into trouble, because you'll say victims' rights advocate doesn't believe in justice, but justice takes many forms, huh?
Of course, of course. So quite quickly, because we have 10 minutes left, a few questions about the gender issue, the gender disparity issue, more specifically. The first question is whether the problem of sexual exploitation and abuse is connected to the gender proportion of the personnel in the field. And then a second question is whether any thought had been given to hiring more women, or even in some cases, women-only units, such as women-only police units, to sort of get rid of this problem altogether?
Well, I think it's true to say if you had an all-women, if your mission was made up of all women, you would not be having sexual exploitation and abuse. You may have sexual, I mean, I don't know, you may have sexual harassment, but you would not be having sexual exploitation and abuse. And indeed, this is it's not for this reason, but there is a big imperative with regard to raising the number of women in mission contexts. And there has been some progress, but very little. And I don't think there's ever been any thought to women-only missions. But it's so interesting, unconscious bias, or not only that, very conscious. When I was in one of my on one of my visits, I was with the police commissioner, and I posed to him that very question: wouldn't it be interesting for you to think about having more women? And he told me that policing was very dangerous. I thought, yeah, it's probably dangerous for the men as well. But I mean, there still is that, there's a long way to go to get people who wear uniforms to think that, I mean, it's a very strange, and it's 2020, no? We just had an interesting, there was a meeting organised by our staff union last week, where 3 women who'd been special representatives of the Secretary General spoke about their careers. And this event was titled "Succeeding in a Man's World." Now, I am still unable to comprehend how in 2020 the UN Staff Union could think that that was a good title. And then, of course, it was chaired by a man. So, and I'm still failing. I mean, sorry. So I think yes, work is being done, but the issue of, but I'm sort of one of these ideologues, I suppose, with regard to gender issues. I went to law school, and I think I was in my law school class, there was a class of 120, there are about 15 women, and we had in our trusts, I don't know what you call it, equity, I suppose, in our trusts, lecturer came in every day and he would say, "Gentlemen." So that sort of woke me up, and I had 5 brothers as well, so those sorts of things woke me up very early, and I've proceeded, and I'm very sensitive to things of this nature. So I think there's much more we can do to move towards a proper balance, and certainly in missions they do, and that's the other thing they say it's important to have women because they can relate to the community. That's nice to say, but not all women relate to the community. I mean so they're trying to say we need to have women instead of we must have women for many reasons, but more importantly because the community we work with will need to see a reflection of what it is made up of. And the same could be said for LGBTQ plus people.
Which that's another question that I saw. Are there any specific, do you take special measures for LGBTQ victims?
Now, this is an extraordinarily difficult area as well because of, in the countries where we are, often same-sex relationships are criminalized. So the complaints will not come forward, and I haven't seen any complaints come forward. But I do know, that there are people, and there is a very effective advocate who works in Uganda, who himself was a victim of sexual abuse. But where you have LGBTQI people, I think them, well, certainly men, and men not only LGBTQ, and not only gay men, but men generally, they would probably be more comfortable reporting torture because that will not be criminalized necessarily, and that may be seen in a different sort of way. So I'm very alert, but and certainly there are attempts to take special measures, but the level of reporting, of course, in Central African Republic, with regard to those cases of 2014, they were predominantly boys. And there was reporting of those cases, but even in that context, I think there are great challenges. But there's more understanding of children, I believe.
Okay. Two final questions. We have 4 minutes. First of all, is there regular mandatory training on this issue for UN staff and other associated personnel?
There's pre-deployment training, which has to be those who provide uniformed personnel have to assert that they have and that they have provided that training, and often UN personnel are involved in that training, delivering the training. There is mandatory online training, which is required from all United Nations personnel. I think online training is fine, but I think we need much more in the way of actual and some form of training with regard to issues such as, don't say to the victims' rights advocate that policing is dangerous for women. Those are sorts of things that more, you can't, I mean, you don't necessarily change people's attitudes, but you can stop them saying those sorts of things. But certainly there's the training, that training could be upgraded.
Thank you, Jane. And then one last question, which is, do you have, or what advice would you give to smaller NGOs who are facing the same problem as the UN is, working in the field?
Smaller NGOs, I think, well, I think they are certainly included. Well, what I would say to them is to make sure that they had the safeguarding systems in place, and more are having the safeguarding systems in place. Make sure that they access the support which is available to them. There is this fund to support investigations. Very few applications have been made to access that fund, so make sure they engage in that. Make sure again, and they're in a better position, they can train their, they can engage in capacity building and training for their staff, which is much more sophisticated, but they must have, and what they must do before they recruit anybody is to do proper reference checks, because if somebody has been involved in this behaviour, somebody knows. And that's always an issue, and you will find out if you make a few inquiries. So to be very careful at the outset of recruitment, to be very careful with respect to training, be very careful that you have your systems in place, and certainly your safeguarding statement and your safeguarding procedures.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jane. I'm afraid we're running slightly out of time, and I'm also conscious that it's very late for some and very early for others who now need to get on with their day. So maybe just to finish, Jane, on behalf of all the SIA Sciences Po community, I would like to say a huge thank you. It's been immensely instructive for me, and I'm sure for all of those listening. It was a fantastic interactive dialogue, as far as interaction can go these days. And I also want to say a huge thank you to all those who asked excellent and very pertinent questions today. So the task ahead remains huge. I think we've understood that. But I think we also all understand better the challenges that you, your office, and frankly, the entire of the UN face in addressing this issue. And let me maybe just finish with on a very personal note. You're a true inspiration for all of us working in the field of human rights, me at the forefront, and I'm sure also to all of those who aspire to do so. So thank you very much again. There were a few questions about internships, but maybe we can keep those and pass them on to you directly. Thank you very much.
That's fine. And thank you very much for your kind words. I really enjoyed it. It was excellent and excellent questions. I really would love that word cloud. I thought that was fascinating, and we could, as I say, we can tweet it. I think it was really, really nice to see. Really, really heartening to see the sort of things that young people aspire to do. So thank you, Anne. Lovely to see you. Thank you again to your colleagues. Thank you to the Dean. And thank you to your excellent colleague who helped me log on.
Thank you.
Take care. Good night, good morning, and good evening, and good afternoon to everybody else. Ciao.
Bye.